1940 Pakistan. Pakistan is both a Persian and Urdu word. It is composed of letters taken from the names of all our homelands, Indian and Asian, that is, Punjab, Afghania, Kashmir, Iran, Sindh, including Kutch and Kathiawar, Tukharistan, Afghanistan, and Balochistan. It means the land of the Paks, the spiritually pure and clean. It symbolizes the religious beliefs and ethnical stocks of our people, and it stands for all the territorial constituents of our original fatherland. The remarkable events of 1940, leading to the absolute decision of the Muslim League to demand their own nation, Pakistan, were anticipated in two articles published in English journals. One, an interview with Mr. Jinnah in an English newspaper, the other, an article in Time and Tide. 9 March 1940, written by Jinnah himself. They reveal what was in his mind at this time. Jinnah said to the English correspondent, "It has been established beyond doubt. The sole aim of the Congress is to annihilate every other organization in the country and to set itself up as a fascist and authoritarian organization of the worst type." He spoke of the 35 millions of voters, the bulk of whom are totally ignorant, illiterate, and untutored, living in centuries old superstitions, thoroughly antagonistic to each other, and of the impossibility of working a democratic parliamentary government in India. He said, "Democracy can only mean Hindu Raj all over India. Then this is a position to which Muslims will never submit." Jinnah reminded English readers that Muslims would not be the only victims of such absolute government by Hindus. There were also 60 millions of untouchables, 6 million Christians, Jews, Parsis, and the domiciled British. He also asked that in envisaging the political future of India, the English should dismiss from their minds the examples of federal government in Canada and Australia, where British democracy had planted natural and thriving roots. And he quoted Lord Morley's dictum that the fur coat of Canada would not do for the extremely tropical climate of India. In his article in Time and Tide, Jinnah wrote, "What is the political future of India? The declared aim of the British government is that India should enjoy dominion status in accordance with the Statute of Westminster in the shortest practical time. In order that this end should be brought about, the British government very naturally would like to see in India the form of democratic constitution it knows best and thinks best, under which the government of the country is entrusted to one or other political party in accordance with the turn of the elections. Such, however, is the ignorance about Indian conditions among even the members of the British Parliament that, in spite of all the experience of the past, it is even yet not realized that this form of government is totally unsuited to India. Democratic systems based on the concept of a homogeneous nation such as England are very definitely not applicable to heterogeneous countries such as India. And this simple fact is the root cause of India's constitutional ills." Mr. Jinnah then quoted from the report of the Joint Select Committee on Indian Constitutional Reforms, which had been conducted by the British Parliament in 1932 to 1934. "India is inhabited by many races, often as distinct from one another in origin, tradition, and manner of life as are the nations of Europe. Two-thirds of its inhabitants profess Hinduism in one form or another as their religion. Over 77 million followers of Islam, and the difference between the two is not only of religion in the stricter sense, but also of law and culture. They may be said, indeed, to represent two distinct and separate civilizations. Hinduism is distinguished by the phenomenon of its caste, which is the basis of its religious and social system, and save in a very restricted field, remains unaffected by contact with the philosophies of the West. The religion of Islam, on the other hand, is based upon the conception of the equality of man. Jinnah added, perhaps no truer description of India has been compressed into a paragraph than the British people, being Christians, sometimes forget the religious wars of their own history and today consider religion as a private and personal matter between man and God. This can never be the case in Hinduism and Islam, for both these religions are definite social codes which govern not so much man's relation with his God as man's relation with his neighbor. They govern not only his law and culture, but every aspect of his social life. And such religions, essentially exclusive, completely preclude that merging of identity and unity of thought on which Western democracy is based. At the end of his article, Jinnah used the significant phrase, two nations, he wrote. A constitution must be evolved that recognizes that there are in India two nations, who must both share the governance of their common motherland. This was possibly the last time that he spoke of a common motherland. 2 weeks later, he presided over the All India Muslim League session at Lahore, where on 23rd March the Pakistan resolution was passed. A few days before, Sir Percival Griffiths dined with Mr. Jinnah. During dinner, Jinnah declared that at the stage of imperial rule, where self government was not in sight, the British were the finest administrators known to history. But when politics and national feeling had begun to count, they completely failed to understand the mentality of subject races. You talk, he said, of the unity of India, but you ought to know that it is a chimera, existing nowhere except in your minds, and in the external unity which you wisely forced on the country. You go on to talk of parliamentary democracy, and you fail to realize that the assumptions on which it depends have no application at all to Indian conditions. Sir Percival Griffiths wrote that Jinnah went on to develop cogently and impressively his two nation theory and to expound the full Pakistan demand. The writer and others present raised all the obvious objections, economic dangers, frontier problems, military and administrative difficulties. Mr. Jinnah brushed them all aside and completely refused to discuss details. This capacity for adhering to a clear cut idea and ignoring all difficulties of detail and procedure was perhaps Mr. Jinnah's greatest source of strength. From this time onwards, he who had for long been the apostle of the unity of India set his face steadfastly towards partition and would not be deflected either by blandishments or by threats. In Lahore, during these days, the earth wrestling ring on the edge of the city was being prepared for the Muslim League session. An immense tented enclosure was to shield the delegates from the sun and from their opponents. Within the city was the nucleus of a riot. The Kaksars, a Muslim group founded on Nazi lines, anti Jinnah, anti Muslim League, and led by a malcontent educated at Cambridge, were fired on by the police. 30 persons were killed during the episode and many were wounded. 3 days later, on 22nd March, Jinnah arrived in Lahore and he immediately visited the wounded Khaksars in hospital. This tactful act of charity calmed some of the bewildered people. But when the Muslim League session opened on the same day, there were disturbances and shouts of protest from a few of the crowd. One man who was present has described the scene. Mr. Jinnah stood up to speak. There were some murmurs, but he stood calmly, and while the crowd settled into silence, he lit a cigarette and looked over them with his compelling eye. From then, they listened and did not utter a word. In his presidential address, Jinnah repeated the arguments already described, but he also introduced one new theme. He recalled that a committee of ladies had been appointed at the previous session, and he said, I believe that it is absolutely essential for us to give every opportunity to our women to participate in a great struggle of life and death. Women can do a great deal within their homes, even under parda. If political consciousness is awakened among our women, remember, your children will not have much to worry about. Jinnah waited some years before he spoke frankly of the crime against humanity, that Muslim women should be shut up within the four walls of houses as prisoners. In 1940 at Lahore, where the majority of Muslims kept parda, he was cautious. But he believed, as he said many times later, that no nation can rise to the height of glory unless its women are side by side with the men. Next day, 23rd March, the Muslim Premier of Bengal, Sher Bangla A.K. Fazool Haq, moved the resolution that was to divide India. Its chief provision was that it is the considered view of this session of the All India Muslim League that no constitutional plan would be workable in this country or acceptable to Muslims unless it is designed on the following basic principle, namely, that geographically contiguous units are demarcated into regions which should be so constituted, with such territorial readjustments as may be necessary. That the areas in which the Muslims are numerically in a majority, as in the northwestern and eastern zones of India, should be grouped to constitute independent states, in which the constituent units shall be autonomous and sovereign. Some time after this meeting, Jinnah turned to Matlab Saeed, who had been present at the Lahore session, and said, Iqbal is no more amongst us. But had he been alive, he would have been happy to know that we did exactly what he wanted us to do. The Indian newspapers coined the phrase Pakistan Resolution for the headlines next morning. Jinnah adopted it, and in a speech that he made later in the year, he said, No power on earth can prevent Pakistan.